Greetings and welcome to today's conversation on addressing challenging behaviors. We're here at the University of Washington College of Education with Professor Angel Fettig, Research Assistant Shawna Harbin, and Kindering Special Educator Molly Poole. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be discussing a pilot project led by Professor Fettig that aims to help the families of infants and toddlers with developmental disabilities get a head start on responding to those behaviors. The project is featured in the latest edition of the College of Education's Research That Matters magazine, which you can read online at education.uw.edu/RTM. So first off, Angel, can you tell us a bit about why it's so important to focus on the issue of challenging behaviors?
Thanks for having me. And I think for me, I've always been very passionate about thinking about young children's social emotional development, and particularly how when they have positive social emotional development, they are less likely to engage in challenging behaviors. And I really think that challenging behavior is something that if we can address at a very young age, it reduces the impact later on in life, and kids have better success academically and socially as well as they get older.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us an overview of the pilot project with Kindering and its early intervention specialists?
Sure. So this pilot project looks at building special educators and other early intervention professionals' capacity in addressing challenging behaviors. The goal is for them to have the skills necessary so that they can transfer the skills to the families at home. So families are equipped with these positive behavior support strategies and being able to use those strategies at home to kind of reduce the likelihood that challenging behavior occurs. I think one of the key things about this project is it really highlights the need to support families. I think a lot of the efforts around challenging behaviors focus on working with teachers, and I think parents oftentimes are also looking for supports at home to address challenging behaviors. And the goal of this project is really to think about who are the professions out there who can support the families in order to address challenging behaviors at home.
Mm-hmm. And now when we're talking about early intervention specialists, can you talk about some of the different roles that there are at Kindering that you're working with?
Sure. So on this project, there are the early intervention specialists serve many roles. So there are special educators who work with children in their overall development. There's also speech language pathologists who tends to focus more on communication and speech and language development. And there's also occupational therapists and physical therapists. We also have social workers who are there to kind of support the overall mental health and needs of the family.
Mm-hmm. And how does your pilot project change how early intervention specialists typically approach their work with families?
Yeah. So I think one of the benefits in really working with Kindering on this project is that they really value the idea of family-centered practice. So really understanding that our role going into families is focusing on working with families rather than just directly with the child. So when we work with families, the families have the skills necessary so that when we as professionals leave the family's homes, the family can continue to work, use the skills to work with the children. And I think that is very valued and embraced by all the professionals who works at Kindering. But this project then comes in to continue to build on that idea of family-centered practice, but then really thinking about specifically around addressing challenging behavior. So, really talking with the professionals at Kindering about what are some necessary strategies that we can support families in implementing at home so that they see less likely needs for kids in engaging in challenging behaviors, and how do we respond when kids use these challenging behaviors and things like that. And so I think oftentimes families, particularly for families with kids with disabilities, they see challenging behaviors a lot at home. And so even if it's a speech language pathologist coming in and working on speech, parents oftentimes are saying, but I have challenging behaviors at home, can you help me address that as well? And so this really provides a place where families can utilize some support in addressing challenging behaviors, and also that also supports the professionals in really understanding how to address challenging behaviors during the home visits, and then supporting families as well.
Molly, can you tell us a little bit about your role at Kindering and what your experience with the project has been like?
Yeah, definitely. So I am a special educator at Kindering. I got my master's from University of Washington, early childhood special education. I currently do home visits with families, so I go into their home. Most of my families I might see an hour a week at the most. And we will address whatever their outcomes are for early intervention. So for our special educators, we tend to kind of holistically look at the kiddo and think about how all elements of development are impacting their daily living. So for some of our kids, challenging behaviors are a very real thing that happen. Oftentimes, if we have a child that has very significant challenging behaviors, we might add an educator to a team to kind of support some of those behaviors more targeted. One of the things about this study that I really like is that it's giving other professionals who maybe don't have an education background, like speech therapists or OTs and PTs, the ability to have some strategies to support challenging behavior that they may not have had the background or knowledge to do in the past. My experience with this, I loved the monthly community practice meetings that we had. I think it gave us the ability to have a facilitated conversation around making sure that we are using evidence-based practices to coach families and support families. And then really thinking about that family-centered piece of teaching parents strategies, even just the basics of behavior. We talk a lot about behavior as being communicative and thinking about how when my child is showing me something with their behavior, what are they trying to tell me by that behavior? Especially kids who might have speech delays or kids who aren't yet talking, and we're thinking about they don't have any other way to tell me, so they're using their behavior to do that. So we used a lot of strategies around our ability to kind of break down barriers to support families in kind of acquiring these skills and strategies and knowledge, and at the same point being very mindful of our bias coming in and being mindful of the things that we often project on our practice, culturally as well as just our experiences in the past. It gave us a really nice open space to discuss as providers in a safe space, access to either new strategies or new research, or just refreshers. I thought a lot about strategies we would use where I was thinking, wow, I haven't really done this since my master's program. I really should think about being more data-driven in this way and how I use this with a family. So it really was a great place to give kind of a safe space to discuss and also access to really structured evidence-based practice that we can be using every day with our families, and teaching families those strategies, not just using them on the child. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the size and area of the population that Kindering serves?
Very big. So we have 4 campuses currently. We just opened our Redmond site a few months ago. We serve most of the east side, so Bellevue, parts of Kirkland, out in Woodinville, Linwood. We're huge. I currently work at our Renton office, which is quite a bit smaller. We serve mostly Renton Highlands, some of Newcastle area up to I-90 basically, and then down through parts of South Renton. So we're Kindering is serving a large area. There are other EI centers around the area that have their own spaces that we serve. At Kindering, we have a really diverse population of kids that we work with and families from all over the world, really, and that speak thousands of different languages. So we really have had a unique opportunity to learn a lot about a lot of the cultures that we work with, and being very targeted in our intervention to be specific for that family, and being mindful and aware of the things that they bring to the table when it comes to their family practices and what their individual family cultures are and how those play a role in behavior and raising children, and everyone is very unique and different in that way. So it's given us a great opportunity. We have this really expansive, diverse population that we serve. So
Great. Well, what impact have we seen so far through this pilot project?
Yeah, I think based on our data, it really shows that the professionals who participate in here feel like they're better equipped to address challenging behaviors. So that's definitely a positive that we see. I hear a lot around kind of being more aware of culturally responsive practice and working with families, kind of knowing some of the strategies when you go into the families, you have the background of the positive behavior support strategies in your mind, but then being able to communicate with families to see what best fits their family needs and culture and parenting philosophy and things like that. So those are all the positives that we've seen through kind of the reflections from the participants in the study.
So Shawna, can you maybe give an example of a culturally responsive practice that you would see in the field?
There are a lot of different examples of how you might see practitioners really working more with more awareness about culturally responsive practices. And that's something that came up a lot, I found, like in the conversations that we were having month to month. It was a kind of major topic, and what practitioners were really supporting each other with too. But, let's say a practitioner could be coming into work with a young child and their family and really are not familiar with positive behavior supports or not familiar with, say, positive reinforcement. There's a lot of, different expectations around maybe what children should be doing, their behavior, what discipline should look like in a family. So a lot of what practitioners might be working with is going in, gaining a greater understanding of what the family's expectations are, really coming from a listening place. Like Molly said too, there's a lot of different cultures that practitioners might be working with, even just in a small regional area. So getting familiar with what are the practices in that family, and then from there kind of moving forward to potentially offering some suggestions, either very gentle, indirect, or more direct, talking through some things, doing some perspective taking. Maybe what is the perspective of the child in this, scenario? Something that came up quite a bit was different feeding practices. So if a family is used to, they wanted the child to eat something, just kind of talking with the family and with the parents. What's the child thinking in this sense, and what kind of suggestions can we get from there?
Mm-hmm. Now, this might be a question for all of you, but have you seen an example of how some of this work has affected either intervention specialists or the families and children that are being served?
I think from my perspective, it's given us a lens to be more aware about being culturally responsive, which is something just as a community of practitioners we've all been mindful of for the past few years. I feel like is more open conversation. But by doing that, it's given us the confidence to have conversations with families about what their priorities are. Practices that we might see in the home maybe we don't think are things we would want to do with our children. However, they're working for the family, and that isn't a priority or somewhere we need to jump in and support. So really working on meeting the families where they are and being able to tailor our practice to them. I think the idea of teaching families the basics of behavior is this underlying foundation of families understanding why behavior is happening, and that behavior isn't necessarily just negative, that everything we do is a behavior and everything has a meaning for there's some purpose behind the behavior that we're portraying. So I think giving families a little bit of that responsibility to, I know that you can learn this, and this will help you in looking at the way that your child is responding to the things that you say, or responding to your actions and how everything we do has an impact on our children as well.
Yeah, I think I will definitely agree with Molly on, really, I think one of the biggest outcomes and the positives and the rewarding things for me as a researcher is to be able to support families in understanding that why kids engage in challenging behavior. I think as we're all parents, knowing that there are times that our kids engage in challenging behaviors, and there are times that it just seems like what we do are the maybe more of the consequence practices that we implement seem to make sense in that moment, but it might not really support the child in learning what's better skill to use in the long run, right? So being able to support families understanding that children's challenging behavior is a way for them to communicate with us, and oftentimes their behavior is a response to what we as adults do and what's in the environment, right? So when we give parents that lens of their children's challenging behaviors responding to us and the environment, it then gives us as adults a lot of the power to think about how do we change those challenging behaviors. And so I think those are very powerful moments that when you're able to see parents go, oh, I never thought about it this way. Those are really definitely the most rewarding times of, doing a research study like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons it's also so nice to be focusing on challenging behaviors and to be talking about it. Because as adults, parents, families, and teachers, or intervention specialists, we can have such an impact.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite things that I think about with that is when we're teaching families these kind of underlying foundational pieces of behavior, it's really exciting to see families start to transfer it to different behaviors, and this understanding that, okay, today we're not just talking about biting. Biting transfers to later the kiddo was doing this other behavior, and I'm seeing I can use the same principles to find a solution myself as a parent. I don't have to have the interventionist coming in and coaching me. I've learned this new skill and strategy that can be used for many challenging behaviors that they might see throughout their day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think those are seen when family-centered practice is used, right? So if we just go in and teach the child a skill to replace the challenging behavior, well, great, the child has learned a positive skill. But then the parents might not know how to respond to that skill because we have not transferred the knowledge necessary for the families to be able to respond. So I think when parents are able to think through kind of the strategies they've learned to apply it to different settings and different behavior, then we know that family-centered practice is kind of the key to this, key ingredient to the success.
Mm-hmm. So what are some lessons you've taken from the project about how we can better support early intervention specialists and educators in responding to challenging behaviors?
Yeah, I think so. For this study, one of the things that we're building is, really looking at community of practice within the agency. So being able to create a space within the agency that providers can come and talk about these issues around challenging behaviors. And as we do that, the agencies being aware of the importance of this space, right? Setting aside time and space on a regular basis, and then with support of somebody who has the knowledge of kind of behavior intervention. And then the other piece is to equip the professionals who's at the table so that they feel they gain the skills necessary that they can continue to support others in the agency. So I think that's a key ingredient to this study, is really thinking about what are some effective coaching strategies for the early intervention professionals within the agency. How do we better support them, and using what kind of methodology? So maybe group setting, maybe individualized, providing resources, whatever it might be, right? So really thinking about how do we best support them.
Mm-hmm. And what does can you go into maybe a little bit more detail on communities of practice, and what does that look like? What does that mean to really create a community of practice?
Yeah. So like the idea of community practice is really gathering it's similar to what I will call like a small group coaching, where we bring together a small group of professionals who see the value of, or maybe are working on similar goals, right? So in this situation, it could very much be we all want to learn more about behavior and how do we support families on addressing challenging behaviors at home. So bringing everybody together. What I do in my session is I provide some reflections at the beginning of each session, guiding the early intervention professionals to think through kind of practices they've used in the past month around addressing challenging behaviors and supporting families. And through those reflections, they're able to talk through like what are some of their strengths in supporting families in addressing challenging behaviors, and what are some of the areas of that are particularly challenging. And so we use that reflection to talk through strengths, and then also talk through, okay, so what are some areas that are still very challenging? Why is it challenging? And then problem solving around the table, because there are lots of expertise at the table that each professionals bring. And so when we talk through each challenge that we might see, others are contributing, right? So through that process, then everybody's gaining skills. individually as well as the collective. And so when the collective is gaining skills together, then they're able to continue to move forward and support others who might not be at the table. So I think that's the beauty of a community of practice, is being able to, really provide a space on kind of problem solving and thinking through and doing it as a group.
Is it common at agencies like Kindering to have communities of practice, or is that pretty uncommon, either here in Washington or across the nation?
Yeah.
We used to call them home visit team meetings, where it was a group of people who generally would see the same group of children, and we might brainstorm ideas through that process, but they generally weren't as structured, and there wasn't the outside kind of expert or person to facilitate the conversation in the same way. Counties have done some things similar to where they have reflective consultation type models. Those tend to be focused more on promoting provider mental health and supporting the challenges of being a provider in the field and kind of what that does on our own personal being. But this has been a little bit more unique in that we have access to people who know behavior really well and people who have access to resources who can support that, and then guiding the conversation in a structured way to kind of lead us appropriately. I think it's really unique because early intervention itself is unique, because we often generally in our fields get siloed into our, I'm an educator, I do social, emotional, and cognitive, and I'm a speech therapist, I only work on language or motor, and early intervention is really unique because we don't need to add another provider to a kid who's only getting speech services just because they have some challenging behaviors. And these types of models allow us to continue to grow and expand and learn as providers, to be able to more holistically serve a family and a child, I think.
Yeah, and if I could add, I think it depends a lot on the agency as well.
Absolutely.
You find, different agencies are going to just have different capacity, and there's a lot of challenges I find too with early intervention providers sometimes, and within the agency, really just having time. So having the space and having the time and having the resources to provide, that opportunity for a community of practice can be a challenge for a lot of agencies in the area, or kind of across the nation, really. But one of the wonderful things that did come of it was having different practitioners at the table together, being able to offer different perspectives to each other, perhaps from their different areas of expertise or just their own professional experiences or different trainings they've been through, so that they can provide each other just wonderful suggestions on maybe exactly, problem solving, how maybe they might try things a little differently, or just to be a sounding board from something that they experienced with a family.
Yeah, and I think for this, particularly around the community of practice, around just about challenging behavior, right? So oftentimes, you might have group meetings where you can present cases that are particularly challenging, but it might not be about challenging behavior. Oftentimes it's probably around development, right? And often about perhaps if you are working with a bunch of occupational therapists, they're talking about issues around occupational therapy. Versus this brings all the disciplines together to talk about challenging behavior. And I think that's pretty unique in early intervention settings, but again, very needed, because occupational therapists going into families to provide OT services, parents are still going to ask them, but I have challenging behaviors at home, what do I do? Same for speech language pathologists, same for special educators. So, this really brings that opportunity to be able to just discuss what do we do when families are asking for support around challenging behaviors.
And now from this work, are there some lessons you think for families that they can take from the work that you've been doing?
Families.
I feel like it's all geared towards families.
Yes.
Really this is who we're in it for.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think lesson for me as a researcher in this perspective, I think one of the things I've heard a lot through working with the Kindering professionals was it will really help them to better support families when families also have the opportunity to learn more about behavior, so kind of the principles of behavior. So in this specific study, we work only with the early intervention professionals through the community of practice sessions and some trainings. But I think the next iteration that we're going to do on this is also going to have some component where parents will have access to training, webinars, or resources to get some background information about kind of behavior principles and why kids use challenging behavior. So when parents have this kind of background, some background knowledge about behavior, when professionals are then there to support them using positive behavior support, they're more likely to be receptive and be ready to kind of receive those strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And as we do incorporate families in the future, it will be really nice, kind of going back to that cultural responsive piece, but we'll have more family voice really as part of the project, and that will really inform us as researchers and as practitioners too, how this is seen through the lens of the family, what we're doing for positive behavior supports and the different interventions that we'd suggest or that is evidence-based and very positive. How is that received, and how does that translate into their own family practices? So it can be kind of a nice two-way interaction there too.
Mm-hmm. So related to this pilot, Angel, is some of the work that you've been doing to create a multi-tiered coaching approach for teachers. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means and why is that work significant?
Yeah, so this is the community practice approach that we use in Kindering is really a small part of our larger study that we're currently piloting. It's funded by the Institute of Education Sciences for me and Dr. Kathleen Meeker, who's also a faculty here. So what we're doing is that we are creating a tier coaching model, so really understanding kind of the professionals we're supporting, understanding their individual characteristics, and understanding kind of their level of implementation of evidence-based practices, and using both their characteristic and implementation to kind of think about what's the best way to support the professional. So understanding it's not a one-size-fits-all. Not everybody is going to enjoy the community of practice setting, right? Some people might want more individualized support because there are very challenging cases. So the tier coaching model really helps us think through individualized coaching, help us think through individualizing the coaching for the professionals, whether it is thinking about if they will benefit more from individual coaching, one-on-one coaching, whether they'll benefit from a more community of practice setting, or benefit simply from more of a check-in kind of model because they have a lot of the skills already. So that project is ongoing. We're in our third year of that project. We're going to be doing our large-scale study in the Seattle area this coming year.
Oh, great. And can you talk a little bit more about what's coming next with this work, both here in the Puget Sound and beyond?
Yeah, so particularly on the positive behavior support in the early intervention setting, so this work I'm continue to pilot the work, really thinking about what are some specific components. One of the things that Shawna mentioned was to really understand what are some evidence-based practices around positive behavior support, but then also when we think about the cultures of the family, like what does that look like? We know what's evidence-based practice, but then families bring a lot of their different perspectives and culture into the play. So really thinking about how do we mesh the two together. So that's really my next step of work. Continuing to find funding. We're continuing to submit for grants to pilot this work. There's actually a lot of interest around the area in really helping us pilot this project. I think being able to address challenge behaviors in the early intervention context is really a huge need. I've talked to many early intervention agencies who are in full support of this work, just because professionals oftentimes come back to the agency saying, I need more support around challenging behaviors because we're seeing it during home visits and parents are also asking for it. And I think this is some work that we need to continue to build evidence behind in order to know what are the best practices that we can use in early intervention settings to support families to address challenging behaviors.
Great. Are there any final words on the work that you've been doing here that you'd like people to leave with?
Lots of final words.
I find it fascinating, and I'm really excited about really opening up the conversation so that we have we're working with professionals, we're working from a research standpoint, and really incorporating thoughts from the families as well. So I'm excited. It's been really fun to work with the practitioners this past year and to see how it's going to expand. Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely a need in early intervention for ongoing supports for providers. There's lots of things that we kind of do on a smaller scale, but there isn't a ton out there for these really ongoing application of supports, whether that's coaching, direct coaching, or community of practice. So I think that this is an exciting place to kind of start and to add on further to that tiered model of having more supports available for ongoing mentoring of providers. I think is really important.
I think for me, I've always had the passion of working with families and addressing challenging behaviors and continuing to think about where do families go? Who do they ask for support when they're challenging behaviors? I think it's very hard as parents to really say, hey, I really need help in this area, right? Because when we tend to think that when our kids are not behaving the way we want them to behave, it's our fault, but that's not the case. And I think we all can use some support around, thinking about how do we better address these challenging behaviors. And for me, particularly for families with kids with disabilities, early intervention professionals are really the main people that they interact with at their kids' young age. And so being able to build the capacity in early intervention and being able to kind of let the families know that your early intervention professionals are there to support you in addressing challenging behavior. I think that's a huge area to kind of continue to develop and continue to send that message and continue to build the capacity so that parents know and families know where to go when they need these supports. And I think that's, how I'm seeing this as a big picture thing where early intervention professionals can be of support and continue to send that message to families so that they don't feel isolated and not sure where to go. So I'm hopeful that as we continue to go down this route of thinking about PBS EI to build that capacity and give the early intervention as a field, as an area where parents can ask for support, not just on child's development, but also with challenging behaviors as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Angel, Shawna, and Molly for joining us. And if you'd like to read more about their pilot project, please go to Research That Matters at education.uw.edu/RTM.